I am Dr. Santosh Pinto. In today's session, I will be dealing with the classification of cost on the basis of elements. The session on classification of cost on the basis of elements will also include meaning, need, objectives, and also a detailed discussion about the classification of costs on the basis of their nature or elements. What is classification of costs? It is the process of grouping costs according to their common characteristics. In other words, it is a process under which like items of costs are placed or grouped together according to their common features or characteristics. ಖರ್ಚುಗಳನ್ನು ಸಾಮಾನ್ಯ ಗುಣಲಕ್ಷಣಗಳ ಆಧಾರದ ಮೇಲೆ ವಿಂಗಡಿಸುವ ಪ್ರಕ್ರಿಯೆಗೆ ಕ್ಲಾಸಿಫಿಕೇಶನ್ ಆಫ್ ಕಾಸ್ಟ್ ಎನ್ನುತ್ತಾರೆ. Why it is essential to classify the costs? A suitable classification of costs is important to identify the costs with cost centers or cost units for the purposes of cost ascertainment and cost control. Ultimate objective of classification of cost is cost ascertainment and cost control. Briefly, I will focus on the objectives, purposes, uses of classification of costs. Classification of cost is useful for stock valuation, for cost ascertainment, for profit measurement, for analysis of cost, for controlling cost, for budgeting and planning, for decision making, and it is also useful for pricing. On the basis of elements, the costs are classified as material cost, labor cost, expenses. Each of these elements are further divided into two parts, direct and indirect. What exactly is material cost? Material cost is defined as the cost of materials of any nature used for the purpose of production of a product or a service. Let me just let you know the meaning of direct materials. Direct materials are raw materials, semi-finished materials, or components which become part and parcel of the product are known as direct materials. Material costs are classified into direct material cost and indirect material cost. Let me clearly explain what is direct material cost. Direct material cost is the cost of materials which can be directly allocated to a cost center or a cost object in an economically feasible way. Direct materials directly go into the product. For example, cloth in the garment, raw wood in furniture, and the paper in the book. The cost of direct materials includes not only invoice price but also expenses directly incurred on acquiring them, such as carriage inward, freight, duty, etc. However, if a material forms the part of a product but is of negligible value, it may be treated as indirect materials. Here are a few groups of materials that are considered as direct materials. Materials specially purchased for particular job, process, or product. Materials supplied from the stores for production. Components or parts purchased or supplied from the stores. Material transferred from one process to another. Primary packing materials such as cartoons, craft papers, etc. Indirect material cost. Indirect material cost is the cost of materials which cannot be directly allocable to a particular cost center or cost object. In other words, materials which do not form part of a product are indirect materials. For example, consumable stores, cotton waste, chemicals added in production process, etc. The direct material, which is of very small value, may also be treated as indirect material. For example, thread in dress and nails in wooden box. What is labor cost? Labor cost is the payment made to employees, permanent or temporary, for their services. Labor costs are classified into direct labor cost and indirect labor cost. What do you mean by direct labor cost? Direct labor cost is the cost of wages of those workers who are readily identified or linked with a cost center or cost object or cost unit. In other words, all labor expended in altering, construction, composition, conformation, or condition of the product may be treated as direct labor, and remuneration paid to it is known as direct wages. This includes the time workers engaged in actual production. It does not include services of attenders, servicemen, supervisors, etc. Indirect labor costs are wages paid to persons who assist the direct labor in manufacturing process are known as indirect labor costs. In other words, it is the wages of the employees which are not directly allocable to a particular cost center. For example, services of supervisors, inspectors, attenders, etc. Indirect wages are to be apportioned on the basis of benefit received indirectly by cost centers. What are expenses? Any expenses other than material cost or labor cost which are involved in an activity. Expenditure on account of utilities, payment for bought out services, job processing charges, etc. can be termed as expenses. Expenses are also classified into direct expenses and indirect expenses. Direct or chargeable expenses. These are the expenses other than direct material and direct labor that are specifically incurred for a particular product or process. Such expenses are directly charged to the particular cost account concerned as part of the prime cost. Examples of direct expenses are expenses for special molds, designs, drawings, and patterns required in a particular cost center. Hiring charges for tools and equipments for a cost center, maintenance cost of such tools and equipments, royalties in connection to a product. Indirect expenses. These are expenses which cannot be allocated but which can be apportioned to or absorbed by cost centers or cost units as rent, insurance, municipal taxes, power and fuel, etc. The total of indirect materials, indirect labor, and indirect expenses are known as overheads. With this brief explanation, I conclude my session on classification of costs on the basis of elements.